I'm Dillon, the executive director of Hudson Hall, and I just want to say welcome to Hudson Hall. And I'm not going to be talking too much because we're here to hear what Richard Milazzo and Éric Longo and Daniel Rothbart have to say. But I would like to say we're just so pleased to be partnering with the Flowchart Foundation and have Daniel and Richard back at Hudson Hall. And if anyone has not had a chance to go to Flowchart to see the exhibit of Daniel's work, it's absolutely beautiful and it's beautifully installed, and I encourage you to go. And with that, I would give a warm welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, that took a lot out of my intro. So, hi everyone. Good evening. I'm Éric Longo. I'm the interim executive director of the Flowchart Foundation. Thank you again to Tammy and Hudson Hall and its staff to host this evening tonight. About the Flowchart Foundation, it was founded on the visionary legacy of American poet John Ashbery, for those of you who don't know him, and he lived here in Hudson. And our mission is to explore, investigate the dynamic interplay between poetry and other art forms to foster creativity, interdisciplinary collaborations, and engagement with John's work and its enduring influence on contemporary culture. This evening is dedicated to a new book, a new collaboration between independent scholar and poet Richard Milazzo.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. And artist Daniel Rothbart, called More Fugitive Than Light, Poems of Rome, Venice, Paris, 2016-2017. Beautiful book. It was published by Tsukuda Island Press. The book features 58 poems by Richard and 70 of Daniel's digital collages in a non-restrictive or analogical dialogue with the poems. The book also contains essays by Richard and Daniel, who wrote on each other's work. I should also mention that obviously Flowchart is hosting a beautiful show of Daniel's work from this book at the Flowchart space at 348 Hudson. And we're open you open on the weekends?
Yeah, Saturdays and Sundays at
12 to 5, right?
Exactly.
By appointment during the week. And we will host a closing reception on Saturday, July 12th, between 3 and 5. And I believe Jeffrey Leppendorf will be giving a shakuhachi, flute performance. So make sure you come to that. Richard's poems reflect a fascination with diverse cultures, skirting a love-hate relationship with his native New York City, while embracing many of the storied cities of Europe and Far Eastern destinations such as Saigon, Penang, Phnom Penh, Seoul, and Kyoto. Much in the same spirit, Daniel's collages ask the question, are they bracketing peripheries without centers or centers without peripheries? About Daniel's collages, Richard ponders, what is the significance of these entities, these creatures made of aluminum and found glass orbs which have broken away from Japanese fishermen's nets on the other side of the world and floated across the ocean to our Pacific shores here in the US, and which, when coupled together, seem to float, to fly in and out of multiple worlds like satellites orbiting, intervening upon innumerable galaxies without leaving any trace of a stable signified. About Richard's poetry, Daniel writes, his texts traverse cultural, geographic, temporal, ideological, and political boundaries, united by unique sensibility and informed by a multidimensional relationship with language. His passion for the printed word encompasses not only his well-known work as a curator, critic of contemporary art, and independent scholar, but also the literary forms he utilizes in his verse, what he has called in the past his story and history poems, his faux sonnets. So this evening will begin shortly with Richard leading us into a reading of his poem, My Portrait by Fontaine-Latour. After the reading, we'll have a little conversation, and then we'll open the floor to questions and answers. And throughout the evening, you'll see Daniel's collages projected onto the wall behind us, which are beautiful, and we'll conclude with a book signing outside. So without any further ado, I give you Richard Milazzo.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric, for your nice words. The book obviously has the images that you'll see above, and they are the collages with the images that Daniel, before I read the poem, where do you find these images? That's really an interesting point about your work.
Well, the images come from postcards, photographs, film stills from different times and places that I find compelling in some way, and I see some point of entry for my sculptural objects.
Exactly. I always found I found that interesting, the way you get your source material. I mean, it's interesting that it comes from so many different cultures.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to read a poem, My Portrait by Fantin-Latour. Why Fantin-Latour? Because, when you look at his work, it seems so incredibly quiet and conservative and just really very distinguished work, and everybody basically knows Fantin-Latour's work. And I wonder what it would be like to have known him, and so I put myself in the position of knowing Fantin-Latour, and so I wrote the poem. It's about roughly 20 stanzas, and it's based on Fantin-Latour's letters to James McNeill Whistler, Edwin Edwards, and Otto Schlottermeyer. And the poem was written in Paris in 2017. So again, to repeat, it's just was my feeling of what would have been like to have known him and have my portrait done by Fantin-Latour. Sitting for my portrait by Henri Fantin-Latour, he spoke about embarking upon the true path, nature, full of flowers, indeed, but teeming, nonetheless, with the darkness of the soul. Being freed of everything he'd seen or studied, he would sit, he said, in front of a mirror and convene, as it were, with his reflection, inspired by the fantasies, the gleam, the sublime uncertainties of the imagination, allowing him to unlearn all that he knew. And in fact, there is nothing more unknowable, yet more poignant, than his peonies and Japanese cherry blossoms. Nothing more severe, more subtle than the colors of the walls lurking behind them. Nothing more noble, more grave, more intimate than his portraits subsumed by the darkness of the soul. My ideal, he once explained, has always been to represent with the highest possible degree of reality things that remain visible just for a moment. Flowers, fruit, our glances, our reveries, I suppose. Yet there is a painting whose table barely acknowledges the corner of the room, but whose walls do not. And still another whose fruit is splayed so emphatically, no madame has ever envisaged such familiarity, neither amid the flailings of her first lover, nor with the birth of her last child. It confutes the mind to think of all those who have sat for portraits before me: Charles Baudelaire, James McNeill Whistler, Edwin Manet, Auguste Renoir, Émile Zola, Claude Monet, Paul Verlaine, Arthur Rimbaud, a salon of subjects like no other. Yes, like Manet, his pictures to this day are often rejected, or worse, by his own account, accepted out of pity, and hung high on the wall out of sight. You cannot imagine how sad I am, how sad they are when they come back to me. Despite all, he still loves painting, loves depicting his subjects, tending, or at least holding, a book open or sleeping. And in his self-portraits, he always seems to be emerging from or returning to the shadows. There is really nothing that gives him more pleasure. Painting is the whole of it, the only dream he has ever pursued. He worries only about whether a picture turns out right and whether winter will return enough spring flowers. In a letter to his parents, which fell into my hands, he wrote, "My work is all. It is my only consolation, the only thing that makes life bearable. If I didn't have that hope, I would have died long ago. In every other way, life is absurd. It's all illusions flying away. Happiness is transient. Then there are the sadnesses. but it is the end of those small happinesses, the darkness of the soul, I fear most.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
You're welcome.
So, your poem invites us into 19th century Parisian atelier of Henri Fantin-Latour. A number of poems in this book explore the thoughts, feelings, and insights of people living in distant places and times. Could you speak a little bit about the cultural nomadism of these poems?
Yeah, I think that recently I stumbled on something that Roland Barthes said a long time ago in a book that I read a long time ago but hardly understood. It was a book he wrote on Japanese culture called The Empire of Signs. I must have read it 2 or 3 times as a graduate student over and over again and hardly understood a word of it. But brilliant as the book was and as not brilliant as I was. But I ran across a statement he made that just moved me beyond tears. He said, I just long to be in places where my language is not spoken, where it's all unknown, and I have to find my way through gestures and through just guesswork. And it's just a wonderful way to be about the bigger world. And I feel like that's what nomadism is in the poetry. It's about going to places, whereas I always tell my lovely wife who's sitting in the audience, my hope is that to go to places where English is hardly spoken at all, but unfortunately it has become the lingua franca. So that's where we are.
For better or worse.
For better and mostly worse. Yes.
So the book follows 3 other book collaborations, believe it or not, between the 2 of you. These include Enrico Pedrini's Irreversibility and the Avant-Garde, an essay on physics and modern culture, published by Edgewise Press, and which Daniel translated from the Italian, correct? Richard's introductions to and participation in the Story of the Phoenix, an artist's book by Daniel that was published by Ulysses and Calypso of Naples in Italy, and most recently a beautiful book by Daniel, Seeing Naples, Reports from the Shadow of Vesuvius, also from Edgewise Press. So I'm curious, how did it all start? How did you 2 met? How did you begin to collaborate? And how did your friendship and relationship kind of evolve over time?
Well, I'll take this one. I was first exposed to Richard's work back in the late 80s when I was a student at Rhode Island School of Design. And I remember I was very impressed with his the artists that he championed, this neo-conceptual artist from the East Village movement, and also the rigor with which he and his companion, Richard Milazzo, explored the conceptual or theoretical underpinnings of that work. Richard at the time was part of a very influential curatorial duo, Collins and Milazzo, and so I was familiar with his work, but then I had the good fortune to meet Richard through Enrico Pedrini, my dear friend and mentor. And our dialogue began at that point. In 1998, I was working on this artist book titled The Phoenix, The Story of the Phoenix. And the premise of the book was that I was inviting people from the arts to destroy one of my digital collages in a manner of their choosing, which in some way left room for that object to find renewal or some kind of rebirth. And Richard folded the collage into oblivion, and he also wrote a wonderful, thoughtful introduction to the book. And I remember I was very pleased that the book was acquired by the Museum of Modern Art for their artist book collection as well. So I was delighted by that. And then later on, in 2003, Richard had invited Enrico Pedrini to publish his book, Irreversibility and the Avant-Garde, an essay on physics and modern culture, that I translated from the Italian. But if you fast forward then to 2016, I lived in Naples in the early 90s. I was awarded a Fulbright grant, and when I got back to New York, I started to write about experiences there. And over about 20 years, I'd written a manuscript that involved personal memories from that time that were juxtaposed with vignettes or stories from the cultural history of Naples. And I hadn't found a publisher, so I started to kind of send it around to distinguished people in the arts for an endorsement, hoping for an endorsement or a blurb. And I sent one to Richard. Richard read the book. He liked it so much he offered to publish it, which was fantastic news for me. I was over the moon. So we started to meet regularly at Hisaki, this Japanese restaurant in the East Village. And in my early career in New York City, I'd worked as a pre-press technician, so I had some basic kind of typesetting skills and layout skills. And Richard is an extremely refined book designer and he had such great ideas for the book. I'd collected images of Naples for quite some time, and Richard appreciated the text, but also felt that there was we could integrate those images meaningfully into the book. And he was just so creative. He proposed that we use a Neapolitan typeface for the header text. And I collect books. I had a book from an 18th century book from Naples that was printed there, and I digitized some of the fonts. So in a way, it gave them new life. These had never been used in the English language before. So it was just a real pleasure. But we didn't only talk about books. We talked about politics and art and culture and life. And so a real friendship was born there. And when Seeing Naples was published, Richard generously invited me to collaborate with him on More Fugitive Than Light, and I loved the poems and accepted pretty quickly, and we resumed our dinners at Hisaki. So,
do you concur?
I concur fully. Daniel gives way too much credit to me. He's really quite a brilliant writer, and when I read the book, Seeing Naples, the first thing I thought of was Walter Benjamin, and he has such a very intellectual approach to writing, and but very visceral. So it was complex, but communicated. It was just a really well written book on a very high level, and so it was not a really difficult decision to publish a book like that, and the collection of images he made of Naples and the people he knew in Naples was so inherently interesting. There was nothing. I mean, I was kind of like a pair of hands. He was really the prime.
It's a beautiful book.
The prime mover.
Yeah,
true.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was a great collaboration. Thank you, Daniel, for letting me do that.
Such a pleasure.
So both of you wrote very thoughtful essays about each other's work. And these portraits explore varied aspects of your creative development and practice. And so I wanted to find out, if you could tell us a little bit about how you approached that part of the project.
Well, for me, it was a wonderful opportunity to learn more about Richard's intellectual and creative development. He's a Renaissance man, and I found it challenging to weave the strands of his different endeavors into that introductory essay. His curatorial work, art writing, poetry, and publishing. But he was very generous with his time and helped me along. And I'd also like to say that Richard is the best editor I've ever had in my life. He's really he's extremely insightful, and he.
You know that's code for I'm actually ruthless and unforgiving. I want to mention on the topic of being ruthless and unforgiving. I don't know, many of you I don't know in the audience, and I'm sure many of you are well accomplished in your various fields, but I do know two people in the audience very well besides my wife, who's an extraordinary lady. Elliot Schwartz is in the audience, and I think without any exaggeration, he's probably one of the really great photographers in America today. And his son is an extraordinary independent, a scholar at Swarthmore, entering into his second year. And the only issue I have with Julian Schwartz is Carol Kaiser and Elliot Schwartz's son. He's downright intimidating. So I'm constantly trying to keep up with him. And so tonight I appeared with a book with my hopes of, impressing him. So That's Julian, that's Elliot, and that's Carol. And my wife is in the back.
Richard, you're a curator, an art writer. You've also collaborated with a select group of artists on books of your poetry. Would you speak to us about the relationship between art and poetry? I know it's a vast question, but...
No, it's a really nice question, Eric. You know, I just want to mention that I've collaborated with 12 artists on 12 different poetry books. I've always tried to work with artists who are, how do I put this, that maybe at a given moment need a little bit of a push, or they need to, or I need a little bit of a push. So I try to go in an area of collaborating with poetry and art where it's more about giving something rather than taking. So it would be rather easy to do, let's say, a book with David Sally or Robert Longo and people I've known for a lifetime. But it's much more satisfying to work with people who... I remember Elliot, when I approached Elliot Schwartz about doing a book with him, he said, "Did you approach me because you think I'm that needy?" And I said, "No, not at all. It was because I was dying to do a book with Elliot and have his photographs associated with my work." And I've always felt like there should be a relationship between art and poetry, not because they both have the imagination in common. God forbid. I mean, most artists today don't want to have anything to do with the imagination. They'd rather talk about how they are appropriating things from culture. But the reality of it is that they have a lot in common in terms of trying to find a way to connect to society, but also have a kind of metaphorical spiritual life. It's a very difficult thing to negotiate today. And so that's really what spurs me on, is to try to see where that relationship it can go between, you know, the outside world and, you know, what we think is our imagination.
Do you have any thoughts on that, about poetry and art?
Well, you know, I love poetry and I read poetry, but I never studied it. I'm not a scholar of poetry. But I always, at some intuitive level, I really enjoyed, you know, pairing or juxtaposing poetry with my art installations. And I was going to mention this. This is a pandemic book. For me, it was not so much for Richard. Richard wrote the poems between 2016 and 2017. Mm-hmm. But for me, you know, I made a lot of the collages during the COVID lockdown, and travel, you know, is something that's important for both Richard and me. I've had the good fortune to travel a great deal, and encountering people from different cultures and you know, different walks of life has always you know, helped enrich my creative practice. And all of a sudden, I was really stuck. I didn't know if I could ever travel again, but I could definitely travel in my mind, and I love to, you know, I found a lot of freedom in the collages to move around and to, and the other thing is, in terms of poetry, I did 2 projects here in Hudson that involved my floating sculptures. I make these floating sculptural installations, and the first time around, I did an installation in Oakdale Lake, for example, and I invited Richard, Carter Radcliffe, and Wayne Kustenbaum to read their poetry by the banks of the lake, you know, and, you know, often water-themed poems. And so, you know, that was, there is a relationship that I appreciate, but it's difficult for me to articulate exactly, you know, that relationship. But it works. It's the analogical alchemy that kind of comes out of the juxtaposition of sculpture and, you know, collage with poetry is very powerful.
So you kind of like your imagination, you read the poem and you let your imagination kind of go and see where it landed in terms of the association of imagery. Is that your process?
Well, generally, no. I read all of the poems, and
right.
But I tried not to be to illustrate the poems, more to it was part of a. There was definitely a sympathy in terms of the way I was working with Richard, and we were in constant dialogue also because of these additional projects and the book. Mm-hmm.
Let me just try to help here a little. I think that what we tried to do, Eric, is to allow ourselves a maximum amount of freedom. So we just approached the association of poems and images just the way you approach the sculpture that you collage into the images. You allow as much freedom to work so that it's kind of a fluid relationship. Right. So it wouldn't be literal at any level. It's purely analogical. I mean, it's more intuition, I think, than any formula that we could actually discuss.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. Just for me, I don't know for the audience, but we're almost there. So this is, again, a multi-branch collaboration between you, but are you currently working on other projects, or what's next for you two?
I hope Elliot, do you think I should work again with Daniel? What's your opinion? I need to have some advice. Daniel, we're not going to work together again, are we? We're going to do another project?
I'd love to work together again. Richard pointed out recently at Hisaki that we don't have a current project, really, which is all right. I mean, we can still meet and enjoy one another's company, but I do hope that we'll be able to, collaborate soon. It just has to manifest itself, some new
opportunity,
collaboration. But thanks to you, Eric, I'm deeply grateful for this current exhibition that I have at the Flowchart Foundation through July 14th. My work is part of a group exhibition that's opening this Sunday at CR10, or it's curated by Francine Hunter-McGivern, who's here in the audience, and very excited about that. And then I'll be doing a museum show at the Gallery of Contemporary Art in Pančevo, Serbia, in late September. So those are my current projects.
Very nice.
Right.
Good. So by way of conclusion, Richard, why don't you read us another one of your poems?
Another one? Okay.
And you pick it.
Okay.
And then we'll open the floor to
absolutely.
questions.
So I have some poems that could be considered, lovely and sweet, but I want to end with a really gloomy one. One thing I want to say about the poems, we live in a postmodern age, and oftentimes communication is looked down upon, and I really am actually an opposite believer of that. I think you should communicate, and I think you shouldn't write for your audience, but you should have respect for your audience. And one of the things I do in the poems is I never write less than 3 stanzas of 4 lines each, because I think on a symbolic level, the first stanza is the beginning of a story, the second stanza is kind of the middle of the story, and the third stanza is the end of a story. And the one thing that postmodernism cannot bear is telling a story or a narrative or communication. So you always want to, a lot of postmodernism takes its impetus from abstraction in the 20th century, which means the artist or poet writes in an abstract way in the hope that it's completely open and to interpretation, and the audience has gotten used to interpreting what he or she sees, and so it's about this kind of enigmatic relationship between the audience and the work of art. But I sort of feel like much more conservative, and I want to tell a story, and I want to communicate. So this is one poem. I'll read this. And I didn't know I was writing about now. 100 days of Ilium. And now, during these first 100 days of Ilium, we stand and watch, adumbrating the brave of old, the cowards we become, trembling, helpless, dissolute, as we witness the fire consume us and all that stands before it. A fire without passion, the fire of nothing less and nothing more than reason, a conflagration of reasons gone berserk, the fire of false heroes and vengeance, false pride fueling shades of eternal night, the shadows cast by 1,460 unending days of Ilium. This is the fire that consumes all before it. This is the fire that will consume us all. I did not know death had undone so many. The living as they go forth, the dead still stirring. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'd be happy to take.
Maybe Richard would read another. Would you?
No, I think one gloomy, because I'll become obsessed with reading really dark poems.
A happy poem?
Do people like happy poems? Okay, one. Honestly, I didn't really understand how that connected to this very moment, that last poem. And then I was on the train over here on this wonderful ride over here to Hudson, and I realized, oh my God, I'm so prescient. Okay, a poem I wrote in Venice. It's called Snow in Venice, Something You Never See. In Venice, in winter, the snow falls inside our forlorn souls. Inside the early morning mist and cold, it lingers on the branch, adumbrates the world as listless fog in the eyes of distant lovers. Drifts of snow rise up, a mournful rain, vagrants between the two windows burn out. Sparks of a hopeless phoenix taking the shape of gray-white ash in the fireplace. In the garden beyond the glass, desolate shadows, phantoms, accompanied by no form or figure, move toward us at dawn. In Venice, in winter, the snow falls inside our forlorn souls. That's as happy as I can get. It's the best I can do.
Thank you. Thank you. Any questions or any from anyone? No? All right. Well, thank you for.
We have a
there
question.
is a question.
So,
Super.
Daniel, your collages, you talk about how much you traveled and in those that you chose for this book and or your show across the street, have you been to, if a place is identifiable as, say, a city or a country in the images you chose, have you been to those places? Did it give you the desire to go? If you hadn't been?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we first, generally speaking, Richard gave me a fairly free hand with my collage work. But there was a time that I was working with a lot of European images, Victorian images, and neither Richard nor my wife Francine Hunter McGivern liked that direction. And Richard actually helped guide me toward these Oriental images, these images of Japan and China, Vietnam, places that I really have never gone and would like to go. But the result was a kind of personal Orientalism that resulted in the collages. But it also felt quite right to me because, for example, I grew up on the West Coast. I'm from Oregon originally, and my first exposure to Japanese aesthetics was at a pretty young age. At the age of 10, and my parents took me to see a tea ceremony at the Portland Japanese Garden, and I was just so taken with the grace of these rituals, of the ritual around something that most Westerners would view as prosaic, and the studied imperfection. It was really I found it very interesting. And then later, in terms of my floating sculptures, for example, the Japanese fishing floats are absolutely integral to them. And these are floats that have washed away from the nets in the Sea of Japan and across the ocean So there are certainly elements of Japanese art and aesthetics in my sculpture. And so, yeah, I use my imagination in terms of those pieces. But those, for example, it was interesting with Richard's very critical when it comes to the cover image, for example. And we must have gone through 50 different treatments and iterations to arrive at the image. And the book is poems of Rome, Venice, and Paris. But ultimately, Richard settled on an image from the Orient, which is interesting and not kind of. And not necessarily something you'd expect to see.
Restricted by geography.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I also, so if you haven't seen Richard, Daniel's work yet at the Flowchart Space, he does these wonderful sculptures, which he then literally Photoshop, I suppose, right? You put them in there. What is your process for that in terms of matching a particular sculpture that you have with a particular image? Is there the same kind of chemistry behind it, or?
Yeah, often when I see images, I imagine how my sculpture might be able to
Right.
play a role in the environment. Not always, but sometimes it has to be kind of a compelling image. I had this this kind of dead end job. I remember when I'd lived in Italy for years, but when I came back to New York, I didn't have any money or any skills really beyond being a university professor, and I just so I got this job in pre-press. As a pre-press technician, essentially, and I had a lot of time during the day when I wasn't, my skills weren't needed, and I started to work on these collages. And at the time, I'd written this book on the influence of Jewish thought on post-war American abstraction, and there was a kind of a comic dimension. I was working with biblical epics from the 50s and 60s and finding space for my sculpture in them. Part of the semiotic street situations project of mine that kind of interrupting expected environments to, or trying to find some kind of meaningful diversion from
the work.
From the everyday.
Did you create sculptures for an image, or they were already made? I'm curious.
I usually I don't make the work for an image.
Right.
But
because it's a different practice. You have your sculpture practice and then the collage, right?
Yes,
Okay.
That's true.
Good. Yes.
I have a question for either one of you. I'm a biologist and I enjoy poetry and I enjoy visual art very much. But I noticed that I receive them in very different ways, if only because the act of reading poetry is usually private and you're reading a book and you're alone and it's individual, whereas my experience with visual arts is usually in a museum or a gallery and with other people, and that there's a lot, kind of a public body. So I wonder how your work, as author and artist, how it's being received in this conversational way. Like, is it transformational for each of you to have your visual work in this private book, or is it different to have your words part of a kind of gallery, more performance-oriented, or how?
Yeah, I think I'm going to try to answer that question. The book was written almost 10 years ago, the book of poems. So you're looking actually at the person who's the genius here is Daniel, because he's being handed a text that was written 8 or 9, 10 years ago, and then he's having to associate images with their collaged sculptures in his images, and then kind of finding a compatibility with the poems, even though he has a maximum amount of freedom and I had a maximum amount of freedom to write. But he was the one who actually had to find some electricity between the two. And I think that it really fell on Daniel's genius to be able to do that kind of thing. It happened also with Elliot. I did a book with Elliot, who's right here in the audience, and it was his genius. I went down at one point to his studio and saw 50 images laid out, and it fell to Elliot and Daniel to come up with, images that worked in conjunction with the poems. So it's really more. It seems to me the vector is coming more from the artist than it is from the writer. It seems my job is more subjective, and his becomes more objective. He's got to do work, this kind of external connecting. Do you think that's closer to the reality or no?
Well, it was definitely a dialogue. I mean, it's true. I was working with poems that you'd written in the past, and that was the
Matrix.
that was the impetus for the work. But I also want to say that unlike many poets, or writers that I know, Richard is also a publisher who has a really unique sense of the book, a great love for typography and paper and varnish, and I think that the book, it becomes a work of art itself. The book is beyond the, there's poetry in the paper and the
final product, the actual book. Yeah.
The object itself.
Well, this actually comes from a 19th century author. Mallarmé talked about the book as a spiritual instrument. And you may all remember that it's a very short piece of prose in his prose writings. He didn't write long texts. And he talks about the book as a spiritual instrument, the physical book. So I learned to have respect for the book as a physical object. And then, when I worked on Seeing Naples with you, and somebody hands you this beautiful text, and you want to try to have as much respect for the text as possible. I mean, I don't want to get too negative because I'm not really a negative person.
But
American publishing, when you look at, unless you're doing really very expensive books, by and large, the books are put together in a rather, cursory way, let's put it like that. And every once, keep bringing Elliot up because we're very close friends. Elliot, every once in a while, out of the blue, I get in the mail a book. And Elliot sends it to me, or a publication, because he likes an image, or he likes the way the book is made. I don't even think you expect me to read any of it. I think he sends it to me as a kind of, my God, this book is so beautiful. So it'll be a book published 70 or 80 years ago when images in black and white were published. Yeah. With a kind of silkscreen. They're almost, and they're so beautiful. And you learn how to have respect for books and unfortunately now with social media, we're kind of like losing our connection to the book as a physical reality. So with a really, well, I'm going to give the human being some credit, and maybe they'll find a way to find that spiritual dimension, but it's kind of hard to find right now, Eric.
Yeah, and just to expand on your question as well. I mean, a lot of poetry is actually performative, right? And it's performed. So there's, I think it is not just art, but poetry is also like a living art form. So if there's no further question, I think we're going to leave it there for tonight. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Daniel. They'll be sending the book right outside, okay? Thank you.